Welcome to the sinister side. Step into the shadows of history. In the comments below, tell us which city you were watching from and what time it is where you are right now. In 1833, the American frontier was not a boundary neatly drawn on a map, it was a wound that refused to close. The Ohio River Valley had been officially labeled settled, governed, and pacified, yet stability was an illusion. Treaties were signed, violated, revised, and disregarded. Native nations such as the Shawnee were told again and again that the land no longer belonged to them, even as they were expected to fade quietly upon it. At the same time, slavery was not shrinking at the Republic's edges. It was expanding outward, carried not only by plantations but by violence driven by profit, mobile, efficient, and indifferent. This was the age of the bounty men. Long before organized police forces took root on the frontier, enforcement was effectively outsourced to anyone willing to pursue it. Notices appeared promising payment for captured runaways. Black men and women reduced to written descriptions, height, scars, complexion, and an estimated price. The further north one traveled, the more those notices multiplied. Escaping slavery did not end danger. It transformed it into pursuit. The Ohio River was supposed to be a boundary. South of it, slavery was legal. North of it, in theory, it was not. In practice, the river functioned less like a border and more like a filter. Runaways crossed it at night, half drowned, freezing, wounded, only to discover that the law followed them anyway, carried by men who understood. That money ignored geography. Those men were not always subtle. They traveled armed, confident, and entitled. They called themselves agents of order. Others called them bounty hunters. Native people had a simpler word: intruders. For the Shawnee, 1833 was a year of tightening pressure. The land had already been fractured by decades of war, forced treaties, and displacement. Some bands had been pushed west. Others remained in the river country, adapting to survive in spaces the United States pretended were empty. They were watched constantly by settlers, by soldiers, by officials waiting for any excuse to claim non-compliance. American expansion relied on a convenient myth that native land was wild and therefore ungoverned. In reality, it was governed intimately, just not by American law. Shawnee communities knew the rivers, the marshes, the narrow paths that disappeared into forest. They knew where sound carried and where it died. They knew which strangers belonged and which did not. Bounty men rarely understood that difference. They moved through the frontier, assuming invisibility, assuming fear, assuming that a native woman would step aside, assuming that a black man, especially one who could not blend in, would be easy to reclaim. That assumption would cost 3 of them their lives. But before blood touched the ground, the land itself had already chosen sides, the Shawnee territory along. The rivers was not quiet in the way settlers described it. It was observant. Movement mattered. Patterns mattered. The arrival of outsiders disrupted those patterns immediately. Horses on paths not meant for hooves. Voices too loud. Fires lit carelessly. These were signals, not accidents. In 1833, the bounty system intensified. Escapes from Kentucky plantations increased, driven by harsher enforcement and growing networks that funneled people northward. Word spread quickly when someone extraordinary fled. Someone whose size alone made him impossible to hide. The man would later be remembered simply as the giant. He was not a myth. He was a problem the system could not ignore. By American standards, he was too large to disappear, taller than most men on the frontier, broader through the shoulders, visibly powerful even when exhausted. His body had been worked hard under slavery, and that work had made him more valuable to reclaim and more dangerous to pursue. Owners wanted him back, not just for labor, but for deterrence. Letting someone like him escape without consequence threatened the illusion of control. Bounty notices traveled faster than he did. Descriptions emphasized his size as if it were a crime in itself. Unmissable, easily identified lightly. Armed, the reward grew with every mile he gained. Men began hunting him not as property, but as challenge for native communities along the river. His movement was impossible to ignore. He could not melt into the forest the way others could. Every crossing, every rest, every moment of concealment carried risk not only for him but for anyone who helped. Helping him meant choosing conflict. Refusing him meant choosing complicity. This was the landscape the Shawnee woman inhabited. She had grown up on contested ground. Her childhood was shaped by adaptation rather than nostalgia. She learned early that survival required reading people as carefully as terrain. She knew which treaties had been signed and which had been broken before the ink dried. She understood that American law treated native presence as temporary inconvenience, not fact. As a woman, her role was not passive. Shawnee women were not expected to be silent observers of violence. They were protectors of land and people responsible for continuity. Defense was not gendered as male. It was situational. She knew how to hunt. She knew how to fight. More importantly, she knew when each was necessary. By 1803, she also knew how bounty men operated. They moved quickly but predictably. They trusted dogs too much. They trusted guns more. They believed numbers compensated for ignorance, and they assumed that intimidation was universal. It wasn't. When word reached her community that a large black man was moving north along the river, pursued closely, there was no formal discussion. There never was. In moments like these, help emerged through action, not debate. Paths were redirected. Food was placed where it could be found. Warnings were passed without names. The land itself became part of the escape. The giant moved when he could, hid when he had to. Every step north was earned. His body drew attention even in darkness. He could not shrink himself smaller. He could only keep moving. The bounty men followed the most obvious trail. 3 of them, armed, confident, paid not by justice, but by delivery. They believed the frontier belonged to them. They believed a native woman would not interfere. They believed size made a man slow. All of those beliefs were wrong. The confrontation that followed would later be flattened into rumor, if it was mentioned at all. Official records avoided details. Newspapers, when they spoke, framed the deaths as unfortunate frontier violence, stripped of cause. But what mattered was not how history recorded it. What mattered was that in 1803 on Shawnee land, the logic of the bounty system collided with a reality it could not fully control. A native woman assessed a situation where law had already chosen violence. A black man refused to return to chains even when escape made him visible. And 3 men, who believed money granted authority, discovered too late that the frontier was not empty and resistance did not always announce itself. This was the world before the killing. A world where the river did not died right from wrong, only risk from risk. Where the frontier was not freedom, but negotiation. Where survival required decisions that American law would later pretend never happened. And as the giant continued northward, carrying the weight of pursuit on a body that could not hide, the Shawnee woman made her own calculation, one shaped not by ideology, but by responsibility. In 1823, the frontier did not belong to the strongest or the loudest. It belonged briefly to those who understood that when a system hunts human beings for profit, refusing to intervene is also a choice. And some choices redraw history, even when history refuses to admit it. She was born into movement, not stillness. By the time she could walk, the Shawnee world she inherited had already been compressed by pressure from every side. Her elders did not speak of a past that would return. They spoke of a present that had to be understood precisely. Survival was not framed as resistance or submission. It was framed as competence. She learned early that land was not scenery. It was instruction. Clear's throat, rivers taught timing. Forests taught concealment. Open ground taught caution. Every place carried a different rule, and knowing which rule applied meant the difference between safety and exposure. Her childhood was shaped less by ceremony than by observation. She watched how women moved through space without announcing themselves, how men listened before speaking, how elders corrected mistakes quietly because loud. Correction attracted attention. In Shawnee life at this time, discretion was not secrecy. It was respect for consequence. She learned to read people as carefully as terrain. Clear's throat settlers were easy to identify. They carried themselves as if the land owed them passage. Their movements were direct, inefficient, and loud. Soldiers were different, more disciplined, more cautious, but still outsiders. Bounty men were the most dangerous. They blended confidence with impatience. They believed speed mattered more than understanding. They relied on fear to smooth their path. Fear did not work on her. As a young woman, she was taught to handle tools the way others handled words. A blade was not symbolic. It was functional. She learned how to throw, with accuracy rather than strength, how to strike without hesitation, how to stop once the task was done. Violence was not glorified, but neither was it forbidden. It was contextual. Shawnee women were expected to protect. Continuity. That meant children, elders, land, and the relationships that bound them together. Protection did not always look like fighting. Sometimes it looked like knowing when to move and when to stay. Sometimes it looked like silence. But there were moments when silence became permission. She had learned through experience rather than theory that American law did not arrive to resolve conflict. It arrived to impose it. Treaties were tools of convenience. Boundaries shifted when profitable. The presence of armed men meant decisions had already been made elsewhere. That understanding shaped how she evaluated risk. When she encountered black people moving north, some alone, some in small groups, she did not see strangers. She saw people navigating a system designed to consume them. The details differed, but the logic was familiar. Removal and enslavement were not separate forces. They were parallel methods. She did not romanticize escape. She understood its cost. By 18 industries, she had already seen what happened when help was offered carelessly, settlements punished, families targeted, entire communities accused of harboring criminals. The bounty system relied on that fear. It made assistance expensive. Still, the land remembered those who moved through it with care. Her reputation within the Shawnee network was not built on violence. It was built on judgment. She was known as someone who did not act impulsively, someone who assessed first, moved second, someone whose decisions reduced harm rather than multiplied it. That reputation mattered when word began to circulate about the giant. Descriptions reached her before he did. Not through bounty notices, those were meaningless to her, but through the way movement changed, paths altered. Messages shortened, people lingered less. Something large was passing through, and pursuit followed close. Behind, she understood immediately why he could not hide. The frontier rewarded invisibility, it punished distinction. A man of ordinary build could disappear into labor, into shadow, into crowds. A man of unusual size became a landmark. Every step he took risked attention. Every shelter that took him in became a target. Helping him would require intervention, not just assistance. She considered the implications carefully. To aid someone like him was to invite direct confrontation with the bounty system, not through rumor but through collision. It would not be a matter of misdirection alone. There would be men who did not turn back. She weighed that against the alternative. Refusal would mean allowing the system to function unchallenged. It would mean watching a man be reclaimed because his body made him profitable. It would mean accepting that size itself could be criminalized, that logic offended something fundamental. Her decision did not come from ideology. It came from responsibility. If Shawnee land was being used as a hunting ground, then the hunt would be answered. She did not announce this decision. She prepared. Preparation meant understanding the terrain there. Bounty men would choose. They favored speed. They followed rivers. They trusted dogs. They avoided dense forest, unless forced. They believed firepower compensated for unfamiliarity. She identified where those assumptions would fail. The river country was deceptive. Water carried sound. Marshes slowed. Horses. Narrow crossings forced single-file movement. Forest edges concealed more than they revealed. She had walked these areas since childhood, learning how seasons changed them. She also prepared herself mentally. Killing was not a goal. It was a possibility. She did not seek confrontation, but she refused to pretend it would not happen. Bounty men rarely retreated once they believed profit was within reach, especially when they outnumbered their target. 3 men, she heard, armed, confident, moving fast. She did not underestimate them. Underestimation was a luxury. When she finally saw the giant, she understood immediately why. The system wanted him back. He was exhausted, but unbroken. His size was undeniable, but so was his restraint. He moved carefully, aware that every broken branch announced him. His eyes tracked constantly, not with panic, but with calculation. He was not reckless, he was cornered. She did not speak to him at first. She watched how he moved, how he listened, how he reacted to unfamiliar sound. These details mattered more than words. She saw him not desperation, but resolve. When she did speak, it was brief, direct. She did not promise safety. She promised guidance. Their communication was practical. Routes, timing, when to stop, when to move. She did not ask his story. Stories could wait. Survival could not. She explained what the bounty men would do. They would follow the river until it failed them. They would trust their dogs. They would assume fear would force mistakes. She told him where not to go. She told him when to rest. She told him to let her manage the land. He listened without question. That trust was not sentimental. It was earned through clarity. He understood that she was not improvising. She was executing knowledge accumulated over years. As they moved, she became aware of the distance closing behind them. The bounty men were close enough now that their mistakes became audible. Horses pushing too hard, voices raised in irritation, dogs confused by overlapping trails, confidence eroding into frustration. She adjusted accordingly. She slowed the giant when speed would betray them. She pushed him forward when delay would trap them. She chose places where his size mattered less: water crossings, uneven ground, narrow corridors where movement equalized. Still, she knew the moment would come when avoidance was no longer possible. She selected the place, not a clearing, not open ground, somewhere the bounty men would commit fully, believing they had cornered their target, somewhere retreat would be difficult, somewhere numbers would not guarantee control. She prepared herself without ceremony. No prayer, no speech, no signal. Preparation for her was internal alignment, accepting consequence, understanding that what followed would not be interpreted fairly. She knew how the story would be told if it was told at all. A native woman violent, a frontier incident, men killed in pursuit. Of property, no mention of intrusion, no mention of threat, no mention of choice. That knowledge did not stop her. When the confrontation came, it unfolded quickly. The bounty men did not expect resistance from her. That assumption cost them seconds. Seconds mattered. She moved decisively, using terrain, timing, and surprise. She did not chase. She did not hesitate. She acted only when action became unavoidable. When it was over, 3 men lay where they had believed themselves in control. She did not stay. She knew the giant needed distance more than explanation. She directed him forward immediately, adjusting his route, breaking pattern. She erased what she could, knowing nothing erased completely. They separated without ceremony. She did not follow him north. That would draw pursuit. Her role was not to accompany. It was to interrupt. As she moved away, she listened to the land for response, for the ripple of consequence, for the sound of authority reorganizing itself. She knew what would come. Increased patrols, retaliation, stories framed to justify intrusion, pressure on Shawnee communities already under threat. The deaths would be used as proof that native land required further control. She accepted that her responsibility had not been to preserve peace at any cost. It had been to deny the bounty system its certainty. In 800 streets, on land that American law treated as negotiable, a Shawnee woman had decided that neutrality was no longer available. Her choice would not dismantle the system. She understood that, but it would disrupt it. It would force caution where there had been arrogance. It would remind those who hunted for profit that not every frontier was empty and not every woman would step aside, that understanding would travel farther than her name ever did, and somewhere ahead a man too large to hide continued moving north, carrying with him the space she had carved open briefly, violently, deliberately, so that escape could remain possible. He had been marked long before he ran. On the plantation where he had been held, his size was never allowed to be neutral. From the moment his strength became visible, it was measured, managed, and feared. Overseers watched him more closely than others, not because he disobeyed more often, but because his body itself was interpreted as defiance. Every task assigned to him came with an unspoken warning. Power would be punished if it ever looked like choice. They called him a giant, not as description, but as containment, a way to turn a man into a category that justified harsher rules. He learned early that visibility was dangerous, where other enslaved men learned to disappear through compliance or cleverness. He learned that no amount of restraint could make him small. His shoulders were too broad. His height drew attention even when he bent. When he stood still, he looked confrontational. When he worked, he looked capable. When he rested, he looked like he was conserving strength. There was no posture that reassured those who owned him. That constant scrutiny shaped him. He became careful rather than bold, quiet rather than submissive. He measured his movements. He learned how to distribute his strength so it did not look explosive. He learned to lower his gaze not out of deference but calculation, Rage was a liability. Control was survival. But control did not equal acceptance. He listened. He remembered. He watched who disappeared and who did not return. He watched punishments escalate, not because of behavior, but because fear demanded spectacle. He understood that his size would one day be used against him decisively, whether he resisted or not. The choice to run did not come from impulse. It came from timing. In sich. Enforcement tightened. Rumors spread of sails southward of men like him being moved before they could be used as examples. Chains appeared more frequently. Patrols doubled. The atmosphere shifted from control to anticipation. He recognized that shift. Running was not hope. It was arithmetic. Staying meant eventual removal or death. Running meant pursuit, but also possibility. He did not believe escape guaranteed freedom. He believed it postponed certainty. That was enough. When he left, he did not leave cleanly. Few did. He crossed fields under cover of darkness, carrying nothing but knowledge passed quietly between men who had measured risk for years. Rivers were crossed where sound scattered. Roads were avoided entirely. He moved north not because it was safe, but because it was less predictable. The first days nearly broke him. Hunger was manageable. Cold was manageable. What was harder was restraint. Every instinct told him to move faster, to put distance behind him, to use his strength fully. He resisted that urge. Speed attracted. Notice meant dogs. Dogs meant men. So he moved unevenly sometimes, slowly, sometimes not at all. He hid where he could, knowing his size made concealment imperfect. He slept in short increments. He drank when possible. He learned quickly which noises belonged to animals and which belonged to men. As he moved north, he became aware of how much the world had been shaped to hunt him. Fences, roads, patrol routes, towns, placed like traps. Even free territory carried assumptions about bodies like his. Every encounter carried the risk of betrayal. Every shelter could become exposure. He trusted no one fully, but he learned to recognize those who saw him as human rather than commodity. They were subtle. A woman who left food where it could be found without asking questions. A man who pointed wordlessly away from danger. A door left unlocked. At the right hour. Help arrived without names attached to it. That anonymity mattered. The closer he came to the river country, the more complicated movement became. Water slowed him. Marshland exhausted him. Forests offered concealment but demanded patience. He could not follow the routes others used. His stride was longer. His weight left. Deeper marks. Every misstep multiplied risk. By the time the bounty notices reached full circulation, he already knew they were coming. He could feel pursuit the way prey feels pressure, not as a single threat, but as narrowing possibility. Dogs bark too frequently. Horses passed roads too close. Voices lingered too long in places where voices should not be. He did not panic. Panic wasted energy. What unsettled him was how quickly his body turned into incentive. The larger the reward grew, the more reckless the men who followed him became. This was not law enforcement. It was competition. Men, hunting not just to return property but to prove something about themselves. He understood that his size would encourage that recklessness. He also understood that it could be turned against them. When he reached Shawnee land, he did not assume safety. He assumed complication. Native territory was not a refuge. It was contested ground under constant observation, but it was governed differently. Movement. There obeyed rules bounty men did not fully understand. Trails split unpredictably. Silence behaved differently. Help did not announce itself. He became aware of watchers before he was aware of allies. Eyes in. Tree lines. Movement that did not resolve into pursuit. Presence without approach. He recognized caution when he saw it. Whoever observed him was assessing, not hunting. That assessment mattered. When the Shawnee woman finally revealed herself, it was not as rescue. It was as recognition. She did not flinch at his size. She did not stare. She did not speak immediately. That alone marked her as different. He had learned that most people reacted to him, first and thought second. She did neither. When she did speak, it was not reassurance. It was instruction. He listened. Listening had kept him alive this long. She did not ask him where he had come from. She asked him where he was headed. She did not ask what he feared. She told him what would happen. Next, if nothing changed, her clarity cut through exhaustion. She understood. Something others did not, that he could not simply be hidden. He had to be moved intelligently. She did not treat him like a burden. She treated him like a factor, something to account for, not apologize for. That distinction mattered, more than comfort. As they moved together, he adjusted to her pace and her signals. She guided him away from instinctive choices that would have betrayed him. She used water crossings not to escape dogs, but to confuse. Timing. She chose ground where his weight mattered less, and theirs mattered more. He realized she was not reacting. She was shaping. When she told him to stop, he stopped. When she told him to move, he moved. He did not argue. His survival depended on not turning control into conflict. He also recognized that she was calculating risk far beyond him. Every step she took toward helping him was a step toward confrontation. He did not romanticize that. He understood that his escape could cost her more than it cost him. That knowledge sat heavily. With him, he did not apologize. Apologies assumed choice. Neither of them had much left. As the distance closed and the bountyman drew nearer, he became aware of the narrowing options. He could feel the tension in the land shift. The dogs were closer now, the voices less careless. Confidence was hardening into intent. He saw her assess a place and understood without being told. This was where avoidance ended. He did not know exactly what she planned. He knew only that she had chosen the ground deliberately. That meant something would happen here that would not happen elsewhere. When the confrontation unfolded, it moved faster than he expected. The bounty men did not speak to him first. They spoke past him. They addressed her as obstacle rather than threat. Their attention fragmented. That was the opening. He did not see every movement clearly. His position was chosen for concealment, not visibility. What he saw was outcome. Men who had approached confidently faltered. Noise erupted and collapsed quickly. The forest absorbed what it needed to absorb. He did not see gore. He saw disruption. When it was over, she did not look to him for reaction. She moved immediately to reorient him, redirecting his escape. There was no time for explanation, no time for gratitude. Survival required distance. He obeyed as he moved north again. The weight of what had happened settled into him slowly. 3 men were dead because he had refused chains, because his size had made escape a challenge worth money, because a Shawnee woman had decided neutrality was no longer acceptable. That knowledge did not fill him with triumph. It filled him with responsibility. He understood that he carried more than his own life forward now. He carried the consequences of intervention. He carried the need to make a choice matter. He adjusted his movement again. He became even more careful. He erased himself where possible. He accepted help when it came without asking questions that endangered others. He did not know if freedom awaited him. He knew only that he was still moving. And as the river fell behind him, a new territory opened ahead. He carried with him a truth the bounty system could not fully erase. That size did not make him reclaimable, that solidarity could interrupt profit, and that the frontier, so confident in its violence, had limits when confronted by people who understood it better than those who claimed to own it. He would never be recorded as free in any ledger, but he would not be returned. And for a man whose body had been treated as evidence of ownership, that refusal was its own kind of liberation. They did not meet as symbols. There was no language for that, no shared framework that would have allowed either of them to imagine the other as part of a larger idea. What brought them together was proximity under pressure, the kind of pressure that collapses categories and leaves only urgency behind. On the frontier in Antarctica, alliances were rarely declared. They emerged quietly through overlapping need. For the Shawnee woman, the giant's presence was not extraordinary because he was black or because he was enslaved. It was extraordinary because he was being hunted openly, aggressively, and for profit on land that was already under siege. His pursuit was not incidental to what was happening to her people. It was parallel. The same logic animated both, that bodies could be claimed, moved, and punished by those with money and guns. For the giant, she was not a savior figure. He had learned early that saviors did not exist. What existed were people who chose moment by moment, whether to help or to turn away. She had not turned away. That was enough. Their alliance did not begin with trust. It began with coordination. She understood that time was their most fragile resource. Every moment spent explaining was a moment bounty men closed distance, so she limited communication to what mattered: direction, pace, restraint. Her words were sparse, her gestures precise. He adjusted quickly. Years of surviving under surveillance had trained him to read instruction without excess. She noticed that immediately he did not argue. He did not question. He did not insist on speed when she slowed him, or protest when she redirected him away from what looked like safety. That compliance was not submission. It was recognition. He knew that in this landscape knowledge mattered more than strength. That recognition allowed her to invest further. She began to share more than routes. She shared strategy. The bounty men, she explained, were predictable in their impatience. They believed proximity guaranteed outcome. They would press forward once they felt close enough. They would assume fear would force mistakes. They would underestimate her role entirely. That underestimation was not accidental. It was structural. American expansion relied on a set of assumptions that made violence easier. Native women were not expected to interfere directly. If they appeared at all in the imagination of bounty men, it was as witnesses or obstacles, not as actors capable of decisive intervention. That blindness was a liability. She intended to use it. The giant understood the risk immediately. If the bounty men believed she was irrelevant, they would not account for her. That meant they would not prepare for resistance from her. Direction. It also meant that once violence began, it would unfold faster than they could recalibrate. Speed would matter, but speed alone was not enough. Terrain would decide outcome. She chose not to lead him along the most concealed paths. That would have been too obvious. Bounty men expected evasion. What they did not expect was redirection into terrain that felt open enough to promise success, but narrow enough to trap it. She guided him toward a stretch of riverland where the forest thinned. Unevenly, broken by marsh and narrow crossings. Horses could pass, but not easily. Dogs could track, but scent would fragment. Sound would travel unpredictably. She knew the place well. She had hunted there. She had learned where footing failed and where it held. She had learned how long it took to cross when exhausted. She also knew that once the bounty men committed to that space, retreat would be difficult, not impossible, but costly. That cost would create hesitation. Hesitation was what she needed. Their movements grew more deliberate as the bounty men drew closer. She could hear it in the weather. Forest responded. Horses forced through brush rather than guided around it. Voices raised in irritation rather than control. Dogs pulling erratically. Confidence was fraying. She signaled the giant to slow, then stop. Not abruptly. Abruptness invited attention. He obeyed, lowering himself into concealment that was imperfect but adequate. His size made him visible in ways he could not erase. She accepted that and adjusted. This was the moment when their alliance shifted from coordination to commitment. Up to now, help could be withdrawn. Paths could be redirected. Silence could be reclaimed. But once she chose to remain present as the bountymen closed in, that option ended. She did not tell him this explicitly. She did not need to. He understood when she stayed rather than retreating, when she positioned herself between the approaching men and his concealment rather than disappearing into the trees, when she prepared rather than fleeing. That understanding passed between them without words. He felt the weight of it immediately. This was no longer just his escape. It was her confrontation. The bounty men emerged with the assurance of people who believed outcome was already decided. 3 of them, armed, tired, irritated by the chase, but energized by proximity. Their attention was fixed forward. Their dogs strained, their eyes scanned for a body large enough to justify the effort. They saw her and recalibrated only slightly. A native woman alone did not represent threat in their mental accounting. She represented delay, perhaps defiance, perhaps an inconvenience to be managed. They spoke to her as if she were a boundary, not an agent. She did not respond immediately. Silence unsettled them more than argument would have. It forced them to fill the space with assumption. 1 stepped forward, another circled slightly, the third hung back. Their formation loosened. She watched, carefully. The giant remained still. The land did the rest. The moment violence erupted was not theatrical. It was efficient. She acted when the bounty men were most committed to the belief that they controlled the situation. When Their attention was divided, when their footing was unstable, when their reactions lagged behind their confidence. The confrontation was brief. There was no prolonged struggle, no exchange of threats. Surprise did its work quickly. The men who had hunted with entitlement discovered that entitlement did not protect them when assumptions failed. When it ended, the forest absorbed the sound almost immediately. She did not linger. She moved to the giant at once, signaling urgency without panic. He rose, disoriented by speed rather than fear. She redirected him instantly, choosing a route that broke pattern, that moved him away from both the scene and the path he had taken to reach it. There, Alliance narrowed again to movement. They did not discuss what had happened. There was no time and no need. Explanation would not change consequence. As they moved, the weight of what she had done settled differently. On each of them, for her it was an extension of responsibility. She had intervened when intervention became unavoidable. She accepted that retaliation would follow. Increased scrutiny, pressure on Shawnee. Communities, stories reshaped to justify intrusion. She had known all of that before she acted. For him it was harder. He carried the knowledge that 3 men were dead because he had refused chains, because his body had been worth money, because she had chosen to act rather than step aside. He did not experience relief. He experienced obligation. He understood that survival now meant more than distance. It meant honoring the risk she had taken by not wasting it, by not being caught further north, by not allowing the system to reclaim him and frame the deaths as meaningless. Violence. They separated without ceremony. She pointed him forward, indicated where the land would change, where help might come again, where to avoid staying too long. Her instructions were precise. He absorbed them fully. Then she turned away. She did not watch him leave. Watching would have been indulgence. As she moved back into the forest, she listened not for pursuit, but for response, for the way authority reorganized itself after shock, for the inevitable tightening that would follow disruption. She knew what would be said. 3 bounty men killed, a dangerous frontier native violence, justification for further enforcement. Her name would not appear. His would appear only as description, if at all. The alliance they had formed would be erased from record, but erasure did not negate effect. For the bounty system, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not permanently, but enough to introduce doubt, enough to force caution where there had been assumption, enough to remind hunters that not every pursuit ended cleanly. For the giant, the alliance meant continued movement. He carried forward not just his own survival, but the interruption she had created. He moved with greater care, aware now that his escape had consequences beyond himself for her. The alliance marked a line crossed. She would not be able to return to neutrality. She had already been counted, whether her community acknowledged it or not. The frontier did not forgive interference. It remembered it still. She did not regret the decision. In a landscape where law led people for profit and treaties dissolved into convenience, alliances formed under pressure were often the only form of justice available. Their alliance had not been built on ideology or promise. It had been built on recognition. Recognition. That systems overlapped, that oppression traveled across categories, that refusing to intervene was itself a choice. In 1893, on land claimed and contested simultaneously, a Shawnee woman and a black man had aligned briefly, decisively, and without illusion. They did not change the frontier. They interrupted it. And in that interruption, however brief escape remained possible. They came with papers, folded in their coats and confidence already spent. The 3 bounty men did not see themselves as trespassers. They never did. In their minds, the frontier was a workspace, not a home. Land was valuable only insofar as it produced profit, and profit in this case came in the shape of a man whose body could be returned, resolved, and punished publicly enough to discourage others. They had followed the trail north out of Kentucky, with a sense of inevitability. Escapes were common. Successful escapes were not. Men like the one they hunted did not vanish easily. Size betrayed him. Strength marked him. Someone would notice. Someone would talk. Someone always did. The bounty system depended on that certainty. By 1833, it was well refined. Notices circulated faster than people. Descriptions were exaggerated, just enough to alarm. Rewards were calibrated to encourage speed over discretion. The men who answered those notices were rarely professionals in any formal sense. They were opportunists who understood how to operate in the gray spaces between law and violence. These three had worked together before. They knew how to divide roles without discussion. One tracked, one negotiated, one enforced. Guns were carried openly, not because they expected to use them immediately, but because visibility itself functioned as intimidation. Dogs accompanied them not just for scent, but for psychological effect. Few people argued. When dogs strained at leashes, they did not believe they were doing anything extraordinary. In their view, the frontier existed precisely so men like them could move freely through it. Native land was treated as unsettled not because it was empty, but because acknowledging its governance would complicate enforcement. Acknowledgement created limits. Limits reduced profit. So they ignored them. As they crossed into river country, they noticed the land changing but did not interpret it correctly. Paths narrowed, ground softened. Sound traveled strangely. The dogs behaved inconsistently, pulling hard in one direction and then losing interest abruptly. The men blamed terrain rather than understanding it. They were not reckless, but they were impatient. Impatience was a liability. The giant's trail frustrated them. It was present and absent at the same time. Signs appeared where they should not have and vanished where they should have been obvious. His size should have made tracking easy. Instead, it made the trail feel manipulated as if someone else were shaping it. That possibility annoyed them. They did not like the idea of interference. One of them suggested slowing down, waiting for reinforcements. The others dismissed it. Waiting cost money. Besides, who would interfere? A native woman, a scattered community already under pressure. The frontier taught them that intimidation worked as long as it was applied confidently. Confidence replaced caution. They pushed forward harder, trusting proximity to force resolution. The dogs picked up scent again near the marshy edge of the riverland. The men relaxed slightly. Relief sharpened into anticipation. They believed they were close enough now that flight would become panic. They were wrong. What they did not understand was that the land they had entered did not reward speed. It punished it. Horses tired faster. Footing failed unexpectedly. The dogs became confused as overlapping scents tangled and broke apart. The men adjusted poorly, pressing forward when patience would have served them better. They did not see the Shawnee woman until she chose to be seen. Her appearance did not register as threat. It registered as obstacle. She stood in their path without posturing, without raised voice, without fear. That alone irritated them. Fear was supposed to arrive first. Fear made negotiations simple. They addressed her as someone to be managed. Their words assumed compliance. They spoke of authority and law as if those concepts traveled intact into every space they entered. They did not ask whether she had seen anyone. They told her what they were there to do. She listened without reacting. That silence unsettled them more than resistance would have. Silence denied them the script they expected one. Stepped closer, assuming proximity would restore control. Another shifted to the side, scanning for movement behind her. The third held back, watching the dogs. Their formation loosened. They did not. Notice how the land shaped their spacing, how tree roots broke their lines, how marshy ground slowed one more than the others, how their attention fragmented. They did not account for her movement. The Shawnee woman did not rush. She did not escalate verbally. She waited for the moment when their assumptions aligned against them. When they believed themselves fully committed, when retreat would feel like failure, when their bodies were positioned poorly for reaction. The confrontation that followed was not prolonged. It did not resemble the chaotic violence that frontier stories favored. There was no shouting match, no warning shot. Surprise did its work. Efficiently. The men who had come expecting compliance discovered that preparation had been made long before. They arrived. They were not killed because they were foolish. They were killed because they believed the land belonged to them. The giant did not witness every detail. He was positioned where concealment mattered more than clarity. What he sensed was disruption, the sudden collapse of noise into stillness, the abrupt shift in control. He understood immediately that the calculation had tipped. When it was over, the Shawnee woman did not allow the moment to expand. She did not check the bodies. She did not linger to confirm outcome. She moved at once to redirect. Him to break pattern, to create distance before the land itself carried news of what had happened. The bounty. Men's deaths would not go unnoticed. Their absence would provoke response. Fellow hunters would search. Officials would demand explanation. Newspapers would invent narratives that justified expansion of enforcement. Native. Communities would feel the pressure first. She knew all of this. That knowledge did not slow her. Her role had never been to erase consequence. It had been to choose which consequences she could live with, as the giant moved. North again, guided away from the scene. The weight of the interruption settled into the system slowly, not as shock, but as recalibration. The bounty system did not stop. It adapted. Hunters began. Moving in larger groups, they demanded escorts through native land. They treated silence as hostility. They pushed harder against communities already stretched thin. Violence did not disappear. It reorganized itself. But something subtle had changed. Confidence was no longer automatic. Stories circulated among bountymen about a failed pursuit, about a place where assumptions had collapsed. Details were inconsistent, names were absent. But the warning lingered. Not every chase ended in payment. Not every territory could be treated as empty. That hesitation mattered for the Shawnee woman. The days following the confrontation were shaped by vigilance. She did not return to routine. Routine invited scrutiny. She moved differently, listened more carefully, paid attention to how outsiders entered and exited the land. She watched how authority reasserted itself. Patrols increased. Questions were asked that pretended to be casual. Offers of cooperation were extended that felt like traps. She navigated these pressures with the same discipline that had guided her earlier choices. She did not confess. There was nothing to confess to. The law that condemned her. Action was the same law that authorized men to hunt human beings for profit. She did not recognize its moral authority. She recognized only its reach. Her community absorbed the tension quietly. They had learned long. Before that, survival under pressure required dispersion rather than confrontation. No gatherings, no declarations. Help moved invisibly. Knowledge passed without record. The giant continued north. He would never know every consequence of what had been done for him. He would never see the way the bounty system hardened and hesitated. In response, he would never witness the ripple of caution his escape introduced. That was not his burden to carry. His burden was to remain free. As he crossed into new territory, his movement slowed again. He adjusted his strategies. He trusted fewer people. He accepted help. When it came without demand, he carried with him the understanding that escape was not an individual act, but a collective risk. The Shawnee woman receded into anonymity. She would not be celebrated. She would not be named. Official history would either ignore the event or distort it beyond recognition. Their absence was not failure. It was survival. The frontier preferred stories that confirmed its myths. This one did not. It suggested that law could be interrupted, that profit could be denied, that native women were not passive figures in the background of expansion, but active agents capable of reshaping outcome. Those implications were inconvenient, so the story was buried under language that framed the deaths as disorder, as frontier violence. Without context, the bountymen were mourned as casualties of a dangerous landscape rather than participants in a predatory system. The giant disappeared from record entirely, reduced to rumor or description. The Shawnee woman remained unnamed, but the land remembered. It remembered the moment. When pursuit failed, when authority miscalculated, when three men who believed themselves untouchable discovered the cost of certainty. In 1826, the bounty system continued its work, but it did so with a new awareness, one it would never fully acknowledge, but never entirely forget. That awareness was simple. The frontier was not empty, and not everyone being hunted would step aside. The place was chosen before the men arrived, not marked on any map, not remembered in any record. It was a stretch of land that looked ordinary to anyone passing through with impatience. To the Shawnee woman it was defined by its limits, where sound bent, where footing betrayed weight, where confidence became liability. She had walked it many times. Before that day, never with violence in mind, always with awareness. The river curved there in a way that encouraged crossing. Marsh crept inward just enough to slow movement without announcing danger. Trees stood close enough to narrow sightlines, but far enough apart to suggest openness. It was land that invited commitment and punished retreat. That invitation was intentional. When she guided the giant toward that place, she did not explain why. Explanation wasted breath. He trusted her judgment, because she had earned it step by step. Size forced him to accept guidance, without illusion. There was no pretending this would be easy. There was no hiding from the fact that pursuit had reached a point where redirection alone would fail. She did not see the coming confrontation as inevitable. She saw it as conditional. Conditions could be shaped. The bounty men entered the killing ground, believing they were close enough to finish the work. Their dogs strained harder now, scent fragmented but persistent. Horses were left behind earlier than they liked, ground too unreliable to risk injury. They moved on foot, spreading slightly. Guns ready, but not raised. They were tired. That mattered. Fatigue sharpened, impatience and dulled caution. Their boots sank unevenly. Their breathing grew louder. They blamed the land for resisting them rather than recognizing resistance as intentional. When they saw her standing where paths narrowed, they assumed negotiation would come first. They were wrong. She did not meet them with threat. She met them with stillness. Stillness had always been misunderstood by men like these. They interpreted it as fear held in check, as uncertainty waiting to be pushed. They did not recognize it as control. She let them speak. Their words were predictable, references to law, to authority, to property. They did not ask permission to be there. They assumed it. They spoke as if explanation equaled justification. She listened without interruption. That silence unsettled them, but not enough to stop them from advancing. One step closer, boots, slipping slightly in damp ground. Another shifted to the side, trying to improve his angle. The third hung back. Managing the dogs, attention divided. The land responded, footing worsened where weight pressed too hard. A misstep forced one man to adjust, breaking his line of sight. Another raised his voice, irritated. The dogs pulled in different directions, confused by overlapping scent and water. This was the moment she had waited for. She did not attack recklessly. She did not rush forward. She acted decisively and without hesitation when their assumptions aligned against them. Surprise was not chaos. It was timing. The first man fell before he understood what had happened. There was no prolonged struggle, no exchange of blows. His confidence had placed him where reaction time vanished. The land absorbed the sound quickly, as it always did when violence was brief and precise. The second man turned too late. Attention split between shock and disbelief. His weapon came up. Instinctively, but instinct lagged behind preparation. She moved through his hesitation without flourish. He did not have time to recover balance. The third tried to retreat. That retreat was the mistake. The ground did not forgive sudden movement. His footing failed where he assumed it would hold. His dog scattered, leashes tangling. Panic replaced calculation. In that panic, the advantage he believed numbers gave him evaporated. When it ended, the forest returned to itself. Sound collapsed into silence. Birds did not scatter wildly. Wind did not rise dramatically. There was no announcement of what had occurred. The land simply absorbed it. She stood still only long enough to confirm what she already knew. There was no victory in her posture, no satisfaction, only awareness. She turned immediately toward the giant. He rose, from concealment with effort, shock and urgency colliding. His eyes searched her face for instruction rather than explanation. She gave it without delay. Move now, not fast, not slow. Now she redirected him sharply, choosing a path that did not follow instinct or pattern, away from the river, away from where he had come, away from where pursuit would begin first. She moved him through ground that forced uneven pacing ground, that broke trail quickly. She did not help him erase everything. Total erasure was impossible. What mattered was confusion. They moved until the distance felt sufficient, then farther. She adjusted his pace when exhaustion threatened to betray him. She did not allow him to stop long enough for fear to settle. Momentum mattered. When they separated, it was without ceremony. She pointed him forward one last time, indicating where the land would change. Again, where help might come, where not to linger. Her instructions were practical, stripped of comfort. He absorbed them fully. He did not thank her. Thanks would have slowed them both. She turned back into the forest without watching him leave. Watching would have tethered her to outcome. As she retraced her steps carefully, deliberately, she listened not for pursuit, but for response, for the way authority reassembled itself after shock, for the subtle signs of attention shifting. She knew what would follow. 3 bounty men missing would not be ignored. Their absence would be framed as threat rather than consequence. Patrols would increase. Questions would be asked that pretended to be concern. Pressure would be applied to Shawnee communities already stretched thin. She accepted that her choice had not been made in ignorance of consequence. It had been made because of it. In the days that followed, the land changed, not physically. Behaviorally, outsiders moved with more caution. Horses avoided certain paths. Dogs were leashed more tightly. Groups grew larger. Confidence became performative rather than assumed. These were small shifts, but they mattered. The bounty system did not collapse. It recalibrated. Hunters demanded more support. They complained about native land. They insisted on escorts. They framed resistance as proof that the frontier required more control. Violence reorganized itself, becoming slower, heavier, more deliberate. But something had been interrupted. The assumption that pursuit would always end cleanly had cracked. For the Shawnee woman, the killing ground became a place she did not revisit. There was no reason to. She carried no attachment to it. It was not sacred. It was functional. Its purpose had been fulfilled. She returned to a pattern of movement that avoided routine. She listened more than she spoke. She adjusted how she helped others, favoring misdirection over confrontation whenever possible. But she did not regret what she had done. Regret assumes an alternative that preserves innocence. There had been none. In 1893, the frontier was not a space of freedom or law. It was a market where violence was traded for profit, justified by paperwork and entitlement. When that market entered Shawnee land, it carried with it an expectation of compliance. She had refused that expectation. The giant continued north. He carried with him more than distance. He carried the interruption she had created. He moved with greater discipline, aware that his escape now represented something larger than himself. He avoided drawing attention. He accepted help cautiously. He disappeared into spaces where his size mattered less. He would never know exactly how the killing ground reshaped pursuit behind him. He did not need to. What mattered was that he was not reclaimed. For the Shawnee woman, the aftermath did not bring peace. Peace was not available. It brought clarity. She had crossed a line that American law would never forgive, but she had never sought its forgiveness. Her loyalty was not to the system that hunted people for money. It was to the responsibility that came with knowing when neutrality became complicity. The land remembered the killing ground, even if history did not. It remembered the moment when confidence failed, when entitlement met preparation, when a woman shaped by that land chose to act without illusion. In the long accounting of the frontier, that moment would be buried under language that framed it as disorder, as violence without context, as danger inherent to wilderness. But beneath those words, the truth remained. The killing ground was not chaos, it was consequence. And for a brief moment in trees, consequence traveled faster than profit. The escape did not end with distance. It changed shape. Once the Shawnee woman turned away, the giant entered a different phase of danger, one defined not by immediate pursuit but by delayed consequence. The bounty men were gone, but the system that had produced them remained intact. It would respond, not with speed but with pressure. He understood this instinctively. In the hours after separation, he moved without rhythm, not fast enough to exhaust himself, not slow enough to invite attention. He avoided straight lines. He avoided water until he had to use it. He chose terrain that punished certainty, ground that shifted underfoot, paths that disappeared into undergrowth, spaces where his size mattered less than his patience. What she had given him was not safety. It was time. Time to let pursuit reorganize in the wrong direction. Time to let stories fracture before they hardened. Time to let the land absorb what had happened and distort it. He did not waste that time. He followed her. Instructions precisely. Where she had warned him not to linger, he passed through quickly. Where she had indicated help might come, he moved carefully, waiting for signs rather than invitations. He had learned long ago that the safest help did not announce itself. The land changed as he moved north. The river country thinned. Marsh gave way to uneven forest and then to open stretches broken by farms and settlements. Each change brought new risks, fewer places to hide, more eyes, more questions asked casually with curiosity rather than threat, often the most dangerous kind. He adjusted again. His size made blending impossible, but it also made certain kinds of labor plausible. He learned where to appear briefly and where to vanish completely. He worked when it brought him legitimacy without attachment. He left before familiarity turned into inquiry. He never stayed long enough to be known. Help arrived unevenly. Sometimes it came from black communities that understood, without explanation, a meal left where it could be taken without conversation, a direction offered without names, a warning delivered indirectly. These acts carried risk for those who offered them. He accepted them with care. Sometimes, help came from native networks that extended beyond Shawnee land. Knowledge traveled faster than people. He was guided away from danger by silence as often as by instruction. He learned to recognize when land itself was signaling caution, when movement slowed unnaturally, when behavior shifted. Subtly, he learned to read America the way he had once read overseas. The farther he moved from the place of confrontation, the more the story began to distort. He heard fragments of it before he heard the whole. 3 bounty, men missing, rumors of violence, a dangerous stretch of land, native hostility, no mention of a hunted man, no acknowledgement of cause. The system was already rewriting the narrative to preserve itself. That rewriting protected him more than it endangered him. As long as the story centered on frontier danger rather than escape, pursuit would misfire. Hunters would focus on territory rather than target. Attention would scatter. He stayed ahead of that scatter. Still, the weight of what had happened traveled with him. 3 men were dead because he had refused chains, because his body had been turned into incentive, because a Shawnee woman had decided neutrality was no longer acceptable. He did not romanticize this. He did not turn it into a story of triumph. He treated it as responsibility. Responsibility meant restraint. It meant not drawing attention. It meant not letting anger turn into carelessness. It meant remembering that survival was collective, even when movement was solitary. He thought often of the Shawnee woman, not with longing but with discipline. Her intervention had been precise, limited, purposeful. She had not tried to accompany him. She had not promised protection beyond what she could control. She had not framed the act as sacrifice. She had framed it as necessity. That clarity shaped how he moved afterward. He did not seek confrontation, even when it might have been possible. His size made him capable of violence, but capability did not equal wisdom. He had seen how quickly violence multiplied consequence. He had seen how one intervention rippled outward. He chose invisibility where possible. Weeks passed. The bounty system responded predictably. Notices multiplied. Rewards increased. Language hardened. Men began traveling in larger groups. Escorts were demanded through native land. Violence reorganized itself under the guise of order. But the pursuit of him specifically lost coherence. His trail fractured too many times. Too many hands touched it. Too many false directions were taken seriously. The system was good at chasing individuals in isolation. It struggled when communities refused to be isolated. That refusal did not look like rebellion. It looked like silence. It looked like doors not opening, like conversations ending early, like directions given imprecisely, like time wasted in the wrong places. By the time his description appeared again further north, it had already lost urgency. Other escapes competed for attention. Other bounties promised quicker returns. Profit shifted focus. He did not mistake this for freedom. Freedom was not an event. It was a condition that had to be maintained. As he moved into territory where slavery was officially illegal, he learned quickly how hollow that legality was. Laws did not prevent capture. They complicated it. They required different language, different methods. Kidnapping replaced arrest. Deception replaced force. Papers replaced chains. Until chains could be applied quietly, he remained cautious. He avoided places that promised safety too loudly. He trusted those who did not ask him to explain himself. He learned how to pass through towns without staying, how to sleep in spaces that did not belong to anyone long enough to be defended. He did not imagine a future in detail. Imagining too far ahead invited carelessness. What he allowed himself was continuation. The Shawnee woman's role in that continuation remained invisible to most. Official history would not connect her action to his survival. The bounty system would never acknowledge interruption as cause. A community would carry the memory quietly, if at all. But he carried it explicitly. When he saw others on the move, black men traveling cautiously, native families avoiding roads, he adjusted his behavior to reduce risk for them. He did not linger where his presence might attract attention. He did not draw help that would expose others. In this way, her intervention continued through him. He became more than a fugitive. He became a point of passage. That did not leave scars behind. Years later, if asked, though he rarely was, he would not frame his escape as individual courage. he would frame it as alignment. Moments when something larger than fear intervened. Moments when someone recognized that allowing a system to function uninterrupted was itself a decision. He never learned what became of her, that ignorance was part of survival. Knowing too much could endanger others. He accepted the absence of closure. What he knew was this: she had not acted because she believed escape would end injustice. She had acted because she understood that injustice depended on routine, on predictability, on the belief that no one would interfere. Her interference had not dismantled the bounty system, but it had broken its rhythm that mattered. As the years passed, the frontier hardened. Removal accelerated. Slavery expanded and then entrenched itself further before collapsing into open war. The world did not become gentler, but somewhere along the paths that carried people north, stories persisted. Not clean, not complete, but functional. Stories about a place where pursuit failed, about land that did not cooperate, about a woman who did not step aside, about a man too large to hide who was not reclaimed. These stories were not told to inspire. They were told to inform. They reminded those on the move that escape was possible, but not alone. That survival depended on moments of solidarity that did not announce themselves. That resistance did not always look like uprising. Sometimes it looked like interruption, brief, decisive, and costly. The giant lived with that understanding. He lived with the knowledge that freedom was not something granted by law or location. It was something carved out, protected, and carried forward carefully, one decision at a time. He never returned south. He never returned to the river country. But the space that had opened there in 1823 traveled with him, and every step he took beyond it was proof that the killing ground had not been the end of the story. It had been the hinge. On one side of it was pursuit without consequence. On the other was survival shaped by collective refusal. That refusal did not announce itself. It moved quietly. Just like him, the story did not disappear all at once. It thinned. In the years after 1830, what had happened along the river country was never formally investigated in a way that sought truth. That was not an oversight. It was a choice. The frontier operated on a simple principle. Events that challenged the legitimacy of its systems were either exaggerated into chaos or dissolved into ambiguity. This one was dissolved. 3 bounty men failed to return. That fact alone should have produced records, claims, inquiries, demands for compensation. Instead, it produced language, vague reports of dangerous territory, references to unsettled native land, warnings to future hunters to travel with escorts. The absence of bodies became a narrative tool rather than a question. No one asked why the hunt had failed, asking why it would have required, acknowledging that the bounty system had entered land. It did not control, it encountered resistance, it did not anticipate. It would have required admitting that authority, when stripped of routine and assumption, was fragile. So the system protected itself the way it always did. By reframing and retellings among settlers and officials, the event became frontier violence without context, a reminder that native land was inherently dangerous, proof that stronger enforcement was needed. The bounty men were remembered, if at all, as casualties of wilderness rather than participants in a predatory economy. Their purpose vanished. Their intrusion was erased. The giant vanished, even more completely. He was never named in any account. His escape was not acknowledged as success or failure. He became an absence around which explanations circled but never landed. This was deliberate. Naming him would have meant admitting that someone too visible to hide had not been reclaimed. That admission threatened the illusion of control the system depended on. So he became rumor, a large figure, a dangerous fugitive, possibly killed, possibly moved on, possibly imaginary. The uncertainty served its purpose. It allowed the system to move forward without reckoning. The Shawnee woman was erased most efficiently of all. Native women rarely appeared in official records except as abstractions. When they did, it was as victims, dependents, or background figures in stories centered on men. A native woman acting decisively against armed bountymen did not fit any category the frontier was willing to acknowledge, so she was omitted. No name, no description, no mention of agency. The absence was not accidental. It was structural. American history of the period preferred clean divisions, enslaved and free, native and settler, law and disorder. What had happened in 1823 blurred all of those lines. A native woman intervened in a system designed to hunt black bodies for profit. A black man escaped not through invisibility but through solidarity. The law failed not because it was resisted en masse, but because it was interrupted. Precisely. That complexity was inconvenient. So the stories survived were inconvenient stories always, survive outside the archive among Shawnee communities. It remained as knowledge, rather than legend. Not a tale told for drama, but for instruction. Elders spoke quietly of a time when neutrality became impossible, of land that demanded defense rather than patience, of a woman who understood that responsibility sometimes required decisive action. Details shifted. Names were avoided. The lesson remained. Among black communities moving north, the story traveled differently. There it was proof, rather than warning. Proof that bounty men were not untouchable. Proof that escape did not always end at the river. Proof that native and black struggles were not parallel by coincidence, but by design. And that solidarity, however brief, could fracture the machinery of pursuit. The story was never told whole. It did not need to be. What mattered was what it permitted. It permitted hesitation, where there had been confidence. It permitted caution where there had been routine. It permitted the understanding that the frontier was not empty, and not everyone within it accepted the rules imposed by money and guns. That permission outlived the people involved. Decades later, as removal accelerated and slavery expanded westward before collapsing into civil war, the logic that had driven the bounty system remained intact. Human beings were still treated as assets. Violence was still outsourced. Law was still flexible when profit demanded it. But stories like this one complicated that logic quietly. They reminded those living under pressure that systems depended on compliance more than force. That routine was as important as weapons, and that disruption, even isolated, costly disruption, could expose limits. The Shawnee woman never sought recognition. Recognition would have endangered others. It would have drawn attention. Back to the land, back to the people who had made escape possible. Anonymity was not loss, it was protection extended. Across time. The giant never returned to claim a narrative. He did not publish an account. He did not seek validation. Survival was not something to be explained. It was something to be maintained. His continued absence from records was not evidence of failure. It was evidence of success. Together, their story resisted containment. It could not be fully claimed by native history alone because it was bound to slavery. It could not be fully claimed by black history alone because it was shaped by indigenous land and authority. It sat in the overlap where American history is most uncomfortable and therefore most evasive. That discomfort is why the story feels startling when encountered. Now, not because it is violent, but because it is precise. It reveals how closely removal and enslavement were linked in practice, how frontier law depended on private violence, how native women exercised authority outside the frame. Settlers were willing to recognize how escape sometimes required confrontation rather than concealment. It also reveals something else. America has long avoided admitting that. Resistance was not always loud, organized, or ideological. Sometimes it was situational, relational, and deeply pragmatic. A woman assessed a threat and acted. A man refused to return to chains. 3 men who believed profit protected them were wrong. That was the entire story. No speeches, no movements, no monuments. Just a moment when the system failed to account for the people it assumed would step aside. The frontier buried that moment under language designed to preserve itself. But burial is not erasure. It is delayed. Stories like this one resurface when people begin asking better questions about whose lives were protected by law, whose were hunted by it, and who paid the price for maintaining that distinction. In 833, along a stretch of land that no map bothered to name, a Shawnee woman chose responsibility over compliance, and a black man carried that choice forward into continued life. The bounty system survived. So did they. And in that survival, unrecorded, uncelebrated, but real, the frontier was forced briefly to reckon with its own limits. That reckoning is why the story still matters.